look at the government system for spending, our constitutional arrangement requires authorization to happen. And the authorization is given by the people of India via the people they elect, which is our parliament and our state legislatures. Every rupee that is collected on behalf of the people of India by the state has to go into the consolidated fund of the state. And every rupee that is spent, there are of course some exceptions, has to be authorized. So the people who authorize are not the people who spend. And it is the distance between the spending and the authorization which is the source of all the misunderstanding and the cholesterol in the system. Let me give you an example. You need money to put fuel in the jeep or the vehicle of the block development officer. If the authorization is such that there is money in the block development office, but there is no money for putting fuel inside the vehicle of the BDO, then you have a problem of allocation. But life has to go on. Especially if you're talking of the office of the BDO, you can't as a government say that there is a crisis and therefore there is no allocation and therefore you can't do work. So life has to go on. So how do you construct a system that is nimble and has the ability to respond to the situations that unfold in front of you? And they unfold at various levels. They unfold at the policy level, they unfold at a very local level, which could be, I am still reminded of, this is 1992 to 94. The district of Palamu, now Jharkhand, then United Bihar. As district magistrate, I got a phone call saying about 100 odd people had died in a village overnight. So you rush with your medical teams to try to figure out what's going on. That's not a time you can actually worry about allocations. You really have to, small things as to, how you take blood samples of the people who are living, how you look at the medical history of the people. Well, in that case, it was cerebral malaria. And mine was a district where we had stopped malaria surveillance. And we had stopped malaria surveillance because we were not having enough positivity in the blood samples we were generating. So I kept asking questions. Why? So you will feel it is, such a dysfunctional system. But yes and no. So why positivity rates are low? Because we're not taking enough samples. That's the answer is this. Why are we not taking enough samples? We have no slides. How much a slide cost? 2 naya paisa or something. I said, listen, you take 100 rupees and please buy a few 1,000 slides and go. So we actually got the slides purchased. I still found the numbers are not going up. It's then that one realized that earlier you had people who were covering vertical diseases. So there was a malaria guy on the ground and there was a district malaria officer. And then they introduced the concept of a multi-purpose worker. In the multi-purposeness transformation, what actually got to the ground was that the malaria person continued doing malaria in the small geography that she had. You hear what I mean? So it's an entire chain of events. Now, when you have this crisis, therefore, you need your allocation. So first is, if your allocations are not according to what the demands of the time are, and if you don't have the nimbleness, then you have a spending problem. The second is, and I use this word, if you use less. And I pause between use and less. Because it's not if you are useless, it's if you use less, you get less. So it becomes a perpetuating problem. And people somehow, and rightly so, call this a problem of state capacity. The problem with terms like state capacity is that many people believe that the moment you found a label for the problem, you solved for it. So typically what the field is, it's a political will problem. It's a state capacity problem. And then we go on to do the things we know well, which is like, how do you, fix immunization or it. But state capacity is nothing but a number of discrete things that need to get done, and which is, like I said, allocative efficiency, and the other is spending. If you look, I'm not sure of what is the data now. The time when I used to run the NRHM those days, NHM now in the state of Bihar, I used to find that those heads of expenditure in which you get money, which has the maximum flexibility, are the amounts which don't get spent. When one began to think of that more deeply and talk to people, they used to tell me, sir, where there is clarity on what has to be done, and there is practice, and there are thick descriptions and samples of, we go ahead and spend because we don't feel vulnerable in the face of audit. The moment you open it up for innovation, then it is my innovation versus somebody else's illegality. And that line is very thin. So, producing the thick descriptions and almost defining in the negative. What is it that you cannot do? And properly authorizing this so that people who want to innovate have actually got self-defense mechanisms that they can show to audit, and not just audit, but by people who are trying to blackmail them. Frontline workers, your management at the level of the block and subdivision, the district, the first thing they're vulnerable to is actually blackmail. Because people are going to make mistakes. If you want, the best way not to be blackmailed is not to do anything. If you do things, especially under uncertainty, there's going to be a minimum of 30% error. Now, if you are making these things, and you also have to face this, you did something that was not authorized, that's a discussion you do not want. So the first is allocative efficiency. Second is clarity on what you can actually spend it on. The third is how much effort, or what I call administrative burden, do you have to carry to be able to secure the money? Again, as Principal Secretary Rural Development of the state of Bihar, I used to say that chappal ghis jata tha ki trips to Delhi to get money out of the Ministry of Rural Development. And then subsequently I was in the Ministry of Rural Development, and I have seen it from both sides, is that the kind of routines that we have imposed on the fund release mechanism and then introduce arbitrariness in the name of accountability. The moment funds have been allocated to you and you're responsible for its expenditure, you are unlimited liability. That's the way it's meant to be. It's after all extracted from the people on the basis of a constitutional arrangement, and you have to have that responsibility. But if you want to make this workable, and why we fail is that we do lazy programming. And what is lazy programming? We have not broken down this so-called responsibility into its constituent parts. So much so what happens? If there are 8 conditions to be fulfilled before fund can be released to a state, or 9 that have to be fulfilled before a payment can be made to a supplier or a contractor, then you will have a delineation as to who has to produce the certification for each of them. It could very well be that your junior engineer will certify the length of your road. The lab from which the test has been taken will certify the quality of the road, and so on and so forth. You can, if it's road construction. But the point is, when the file then gets constructed, and there has to be an approval, which typically reads as follows, if I say in Hindi or in English, all the conditions for payment or fund release have been met. This is the thing, may kindly approve. Now you look at that may kindly approve with 12.2 of GFR, the person who's authorizing expenditure is a dead duck. Would you, who does not want to go to jail, who lives on a limited income, yet wants to be a reform champion, but have children to educate and do not want to go to jail, forget jail, jail may or may not happen, but at least do not want a vigilance case opened against you which never ends. I mean, that's also alright. A departmental proceeding and a vigilance case coming on to you is also alright. It's part for the course. But one that never ends, and till it ends your promotion, your career is actually put on a ventilator. That's not sanity, right? So what we have done is that unconsciously, in the effort to put accountability into the system, we have produced an unaccountable system. Because your accountability is only for wrongdoing. There is no accountability for no doing. So what happens? I go from the state of Bihar to the Joint Secretary in Government of India, which I later was, and ask for my money for MGNRGS, DDU-JKY, or whatever it is. And then this unlimited liability is confronted. So how do you protect against that? By thickening the file. Query number 1, query number 2, you answer it. Then query number 3 comes after, and every query means 1.5 months of further querying. So I, as a principal secretary, will ask my joint secretary in the state, who will then ask the district magistrate, who will then ask the deputy development commissioner, who will then ask the BDO, who will then ask the panchayat secretary. And by that entire thing is completed, 2 months have gone, and I go with that, then the third one will come. So we have actually set ourselves a system which we should be grateful if people are actually putting pen to paper given the way it has worked. But by the way, there is a solution to this. The solution to this is actually to have bounded liabilities and to take responsibility for systemic liabilities at the appropriate level, not at the level at which people are releasing money. What you need is actually a separation. India has had separation of the judiciary and the legislature and the state. We don't have that in programming. So if you want the system to work, then while you will have the criteria for payment to be decided at the appropriate level, then who is responsible for what has to be a bounded accountability. So if I am responsible for certifying the quality of a road, that's all I am responsible for. If I am responsible for certifying the length of the road, that's all I am responsible for. And there should be nobody other than an algorithm which will measure whether the 4 or the 8 or the 9 conditions have been met, and if they are, will then algorithmically release that payment. If that payment turns out to be a false payment, then you have to go back to the drawing board and see, do you need to modify the conditions of payment and not have a footloose and fancy-free pen-holding bureaucrat who has the responsibility and the liability and the motivation and every incentive to thicken the file, so that in the unlikely event of something going wrong and detected 10 years from now, my career is still protected. So to recapitulate, you need allocated efficiency, you need the ability to secure the money to the point where you can actually spend, and then you need liability that is collectively exercised at the appropriate level, but bounded accountability for people who are working the system. So they have the confidence that they will be held responsible for what they do. However, one more thing, because you always have to have the principle of maker-checker. So it is perfectly in the course of things to have the person who is responsible for certification being supervised one level above. So you should hold that person and the supervisor liable, but not a 5-layered, machine, and you hold everybody liable. That is the recipe for the disaster that you see today. And that is why you will find that I also was expenditure secretary of the government of Bihar. I actually depended on the inefficiency of my departments to balance my budget. So my performance depended on the lack of performance of the others, because expenditure secretary, my principal goal is to ensure the books balance. And I depended on that inefficiency. So you can't have a system with incentives so peculiarly screwed up and then expect things will happen. So every time something goes wrong, what you hear a clamor for accountability. So what do? If something was authorized at the level of a video, something went wrong, they will say no, DM. Something went wrong, no, secretary. What are you doing? You are simply piling on. It's like saying, right? Here is a person who is obese with a body mass index which is completely off the radar. And that person does something wrong. And you say, no, he needs more nutrition. Pile on the cholesterol. And then you expect him to run a 100-meter race in 9.7 seconds. How do you ensure that rules are followed, both in letter and spirit? And according to me, the way to do this is to actually collapse the distance between a programmatic activity, its accounting, which is programmatic accounting. Sorry, before that, programmatic activity, its payment, its accounting, and the data required for its audit. Let me give you the example of a ASHA worker who is today eligible for incentive payment for institutional delivery. It means that if she can motivate a pregnant woman to go to an institution authorized to conduct institutional deliveries, then that very act of motivation, measured by the fact that she brought the woman proclaims that the ASHA worker had a role to play, is recorded inside our system, makes her eligible for 400 to 600 rupees for every such institution. Very clear, bounded payment. And mind you, an ASHA worker is not running away anywhere. It is a person with whom you have iterative payment relationships month after month after month after. And recently the WHO has just recognized the ASHAs for the enormous role that they have played in India's health system. But yet, look at our payment system for ASHA workers. Typical delays are 2 to 3 months. And there are certain items in which the ASHA can actually be paid an incentive amount, which has just fallen off the wayside because of disuse. Because nobody believes that they will get paid, because they've never been paid for the last 2 years. But it's there in the books. So let's take this example of what is the programmatic activity? Institutional delivery. What is the programmatic payment? 600 rupees. But how do we have it now? In the end of the month, the Ashas will be asked to produce a claim of all the work that she has done, which her supervisor will look at the records and certify was correct, will then be approved by somebody, and payment is to happen. Perfectly right? I mean, that's the way we think it should operate. But imagine the administrative burden that we are putting on the Asha worker to first of all file a claim about which all the records exist inside government. So why should she even file a claim? If your record has the fact that she brought 4 women for institutional delivery, why can't you pay her basis then? Why do you want her to? People will call this business process reengineering, so consultants can get some money to do this. This is just plain common sense. There's nothing technical about public finance, and frankly, common sense is all that is needed to be able to set 80% of our systems right. In fact, the biggest problem we have in government is a complete misallocation of HR resources. Because, again, lazy programming. As Principal Secretary, Rural Development, I used to be always accosted by honorable members of the Legislative Assembly and honorable ministers saying, Mathew Sabek, acha video ko de. I've also been in conversations where the political representatives are going to our personal secretary saying, ek acha collector chahiye. Arey, everything acha hi chahiye. To kya ye possible hai kya? Life is a normal curve, no? Where you have ordinary people in the middle and extraordinary people and extraordinary dysfunctional people on the edges. If you want all your districts to be manned only by extraordinary people, and all your blocks to be manned only by extraordinary, then you have to look at a different sort of, life circumstances where normal curves don't, and statistically we know most of the things are normal. So, our failure to delineate the difference between what are simple tasks to be performed, complicated tasks to be performed, and complex tasks to be performed is at the heart of many of these problems, including our public finance and spending problems. Coming back to the Asha worker, if you could design a system, and now people will say, no, ये सब digital है, state capacity नहीं तो digital कैसे होगा? In fact, it is where state capacity is poor that digital is needed even more. Because the great thing about digital is that it can enforce a system. Digital is my way or the highway. It's a complete idiot box, right? It's garbage in, garbage out, good things and good things out. So it can actually get rigor or method into a system where is, all over the place. Anyway, so coming back to the example of the Asha worker. Institutional delivery, system recognized it has happened, has immediately put 600 rupees into the account of the Asha worker. Not necessarily daily payment, but the Asha worker should know at the end of the day what is the meter. I mean, is she standing at 600 into 3? 1,800 rupees is today's, payable, receivable, and just waiting for the month end to happen so the money will be triggered. She should know. And there is no administrative, you completely take away administrative burden of her filing a claim. Then comes the case of her supervisor verifying the claim. Typically in government, what you will have is that 5% janch hogi, 10% janch hogi. Again, fairly legitimate things to do. But the trick or where our systems break down is kaun sa 5%. I still remember a case where the state government was very keen that the Narega works are inspected according to a certain hierarchy of inspections. saying that, the program officer should inspect this much, the BDO should inspect, subdivisional officer, and then we had nodal officers from the district going and, doing 1% charge. This become extortion rackets. If the person who is inspecting has complete freedom on what constitutes that 1%. So if it's muster roll, which scheme, which worker, if that person who's inspecting is going to decide, you're losing two things. One is that you're losing the statistical reliability of that exercise. Because it's not random. So you lost it. The representativeness is lost because of a methodological flaw. And the administrative consequence is that there's a huge asymmetry of power between the person who's going to inspect and the person who's being inspected. So simply the choice of which scheme itself can determine what the result is. So typical conversation, I'm not saying it's always the case, but in the rare issue. See, most of this is a threat perception, which is the problem, not the actuality. But a typical conversation is better, बता देना यार कहाँ तुम चाहते हो मेरा इंस्पेक्शन हो, लेकिन उसके लिए थोड़ा सा बनता है. If we can just avoid this to a systematic randomization process, by which the person who is inspecting, here in this case the supervisor, which is that 5% will be determined by the system through a random number generator. And they are told, सुनो यार इस हफ्ता में आपको ये केस जो है आपको वेरीफाई करनी है. The system will just, what you do by doing these simple, well thought out things, you take the sand out of our gears. Today we have a system, imagine a gear, right? Many wheels that need to move so that programmatic activity can happen, right? Many gears need to. But we have filled these gears with sand, or cholesterol, right? So, through interventions like first in, first out, FIFO, anonymization, removing the monopoly of access. I mean, when I was studying in university in the 1970s and 80s, we had to go to the railway station to buy a ticket. Then we had the great miracle of IRCTs, which said you could book it online. But you could also go to the railway station. You could also go to a travel agent. In all three cases, we were using the same backbone of IRCTC. But the real innovation happened when IRCTC opened up APIs and made it possible for Make My Trip, Clear Trip, etc. to offer the same service. So what you did was you broke the monopoly of access. What happens? So people say digitization, computerization. You can have computerization and digitization and nothing happening for the user. Driving license was a very good example. Fully computerized. But monopoly of access, you have to go to the RTO office. And you have to go through the touts there. इसके बिना आपका होगा ही नहीं. So if you can break that monopoly, so see simple concepts, if you can put in place, you can not only reduce the administrative burden, you can make it much more citizen friendly, and you can ensure that people are paid on time and there is clarity. Today, the best of people and companies don't want to engage with government because of the uncertainty of payment. And you do not know when you will get it, whether you will get it or not, and when you will get it. You can break these things. So, in the same way that an ASHA worker has to face administrative burden, as heads of department, we have to face administrative burden imposed upon us by the union government to secure the money. So, G2G payments, government to government, or government to public, all of this are just waiting for rounds of significant commonsensical approach to ensuring that money gets paid. So, I started by talking of collapsing the distance between a programmatic activity, programmatic payment, which is historically described, then programmatic accounting. We come to that. What is accounting? Accounting is simply marking an expenditure voucher to its correct head. Why can't you do this before the expenditure happens? Ensure that your account is marked before it's spent. The problem goes away. Data for audit, digital process, entire thing transparent. I have said this on many occasions. The tragedy or the peculiarity of government is that चोर को पकड़ना है तो चोर की मदद चाहिए. Somebody has come and robbed my house, and the only way that the thief can be discovered if the thief himself says. And let me give an example of that. And this happens because of the way reporting happens. So imagine that I am a subdivision officer. It was in 1987 that I first became a subdivision officer. And I still remember, Varmaji was the additional collector in charge of revenue, Khagadia district. Varmaji हमको कहा था कि मैथ्यू जी आइए, I was a young IAS officer. तो मैथ्यू जी आइए, मैं आपको दिखाता हूँ कि मेरा जो revenue collection है, हर एक साल 100%. Varmaji बताइए कैसा है? He said, 1st of April, when the financial year starts, I convene a meeting of all my Anchal Adhikaris. They call Tahsildars, and I prepare a sheet for each of them where dated the 31st of March of the subsequent year, they are already reporting to me 100% collection, signing it and giving it to me. Perfect. Then he says, कि मैथ्यू जी मैं कोई fudging का प्रोत्साहन नहीं कर रहा हूं. I am not encouraging fudging. I am ensuring accountability. Because this fellow has already given to me 100% expenditure, तो मुझे कुछ करना नहीं है, क्योंकि वो तो करेगा ही करेगा. But that is a charitable way to look at it. But what is the uncharitable way to look at this? The uncharitable way is that हो या नहीं हो या ना हो, 100% report ही कर सकता है. क्या दिक्कत है? Because what do you report? My collection target was 25 lakhs. I am reporting I have collected 25 lakhs. Now, imagine I am exaggerating. It was only 2.5 lakhs, which I was reporting as 25 lakhs. Right? कैसे पकड़ोगे यार? You have to verify every person from which it was collected. वो information किसके पास है? मेरे पास है. I am the thief. मेरे बिना तो आप मेरे theft को पकड़िएगा. This is the reality. So you have to adopt certain other principles, which is the primary unit of activity has to be captured so that its observability upwards, sideways, and where useful to the public. If that is ensured, अपने आप 80% will solve. No? 80% will solve. Instead कि हम 5% जांच लगा रहे हो, 7% लगा रहे हो, इसके ऊपर ऑडिट बैठा रहा हूं, इसके ऊपर असेंबली कमेटी लगा. It's good to produce a narrative of a highly accountable society with a highly accountable government. Do you know that the then Comptroller and Auditor General of India, Maheshji, who I have the greatest respect for, he once made a statement that audit in India is actually unrepresentative. Because audit never checks all the cases. Audit samples, checks, ensures that the sampling strategy is such so that there is enough power, so it becomes representative. But audit in India can never do that, because if they are coming to audit my office, I will ensure they get only to see the papers which I want them to see. Because क्या बोलेंगे? Sir, file नहीं ले रहा है. Or if you want to take the 25 lakhs to 2.5 lakh story, we have something called Lipiki Bool. It's called clerical error. Sir, clerical error. It's a non-commonsensical approach to statecraft, which has to be built brick by brick, starting with a separation between tasks that are simple, complicated and complex. Using the people on the right side of your distribution for the complex tasks and making it possible for ordinary people to do ordinary things to produce extraordinary results. Just in time. Just in time doesn't mean 4 times a year, 8 times a year, 12 times a year. No, it means just in time. Which means that when a rupee has to go out of the government system, which is the Consolidated Fund of India, Consolidated Fund of the state, and the accounts of your local bodies. This is the entire deck of our representative institutions. Then, whoever collected the money or is the custodian of that money, it should go to the next layers through an accounting process, but should go out of the system instantaneously. Why is it important? This is important because of the multi-layered nature of our representative institutions, and that's the way it should be. We have the big danger of poverty, plenty, scarcity, and abundance coexisting at the same time. Let me give you an example. As Principal Secretary in Bihar, I deal with all my districts. My districts deal with all the blocks. If you do not have just in time, what do? You have a system which is push and wait. Push money down once a year, twice a year, 4 times a year, 12 times a year. Be my guest. But you push. And then what do? You wait. Wait is the problem. Because you will always have some entities which are moving faster and others that move at a slower pace. The faster moving people will exhaust their money. The slower moving people will not. When you aggregate, very often you do not meet the one conditionality among 8, 9, 10, 12 that requires to be fulfilled before the next tranche can come, which is typically 60, 70, 80% of expenditure. So what do you have? Scarcity, districts moving fast, blocks moving fast, abundance, those unable to move fast. So perfectly legitimate reasons. If on the other hand, you have just in time, then the money is held centrally. But just held centrally. But disbursed decentralized. Because all of us have got this problem with centralization, right? We think central is bad. We think decentralization is good. This centralization is the decentralization of the most extreme form. Because all the money that you are entitled to get in a year, you are having access to it when you need it. Is that not decentralization? Just because you kept the money centrally, it doesn't mean you are centralizing. You are actually decentralizing. It sounds like an oxymoron. Decentralization equals centralization. I'm still in my sanity. I can assure you, doctors have certified my sanity. So that's the kind of imagination you need if you want to say this. So just in time becomes important because of the scarcity, abundance, dichotomy, contradiction that you tend to see in the system. And this amplifies the more you come. And this is why most, particularly social development ministries at government revenue and the states, invariably have money unspent, which they hide by reallocation, etc. We can do the jugglery, but really in terms of the legislative intent, we are actually falling short. But just in time on its own is loved by the public finance folks and accountants because interest costs go down because borrowing, and it's a much easier system to operate. But if you do not operate it alongside a smart payment system, which is algorithmic release, because people seem to think that we've solved this pipeline problem because we have India is one of the biggest direct benefits transfer systems in the world. But don't forget, DBT is after the decision to pay has been taken. The problem that remains, I'm not saying that DBT is not a significant improvement in the way we run our state, but the next summit we have to conquer is the decision to pay. The smoothness of your system or the removal of the cholesterol in the system, making politics work, all of that requires just in time to operate alongside smart payments, which is the algorithmic release, basis deep thought on what is the criteria for release and who or what will determine the fulfillment of the credit. I'd say what because sometimes it's databases which will determine. Sometimes it's people and therefore who. So who, what is it? The other thing that we also have to, it actually comes together, it's a constellation together. Just in time, smart payments and single source of truth is important because if you do not have a single source of truth, you will insist on rigid, monolithic digital systems to operate your public finance architecture or do reasonable programming. The times when we were designing MG and REGS and we all worked very hard and we are very proud of what is narega.nic.in. It's called Narega Soft and Certain. We're very proud of it. But you must remember it came at a time when our thinking was monolithic. Now we know, and that's what ABDM, the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission is doing, is that it has broken this down into registries and standards. The moment you have registries for single source of truth, so in ABDM you have single source of truth for providers, that's hospitals, single source of truth for beneficiaries, single source of truth for pharmacies, it's all registries. Even professionals are registries. So the moment you have your registries and data standards, then you can open up for complete decentralization innovation from the way your digital systems are built. Every block can build its own digital system. Every district can build on digital system. Every state can build its own digital systems. Because you have single source of truth, SSOT, and data standards. And the best way to fix that is to actually have the finance department putting in place a digital system which will enforce registries and data standards. So that's the meaning of these terms, and they actually are a bouquet of interventions that you need to do.